Our next presentation and the final of panel 2 will be Kyle Melatti and his presentation, Religion and Politics in the 2016 Election, a Stakeholder Analysis. Kyle, please begin.
Great. So good afternoon for those of you on the East Coast, and good morning for those of you at UWM. My name is Kyle Melatti. I'm originally from Las Vegas, Nevada, but I now study public policy and political science at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina. Today, I have the proud privilege of presenting my research from this semester at the Sanford School of Public Policy under Professor Abdullah Antepli on religion and politics in the 2016 election. This is, of course, a sensitive topic for many, so I truly do appreciate the freedom of intellect granted to me by the Sanford School to talk about such topics openly, and I equally appreciate everyone at UWM for having me today. So why the particular interest in 2016? Well, it comes without saying that the 2016 election was one of the most unusual, wild, and divisive elections in American history. Deciding between Donald J. Trump and Hillary Clinton wound up as a battle of ideology and character not seen in decades. Clinton was entangled in an email scandal, Trump had a slew of controversies from his past and during the campaign, and many people were concerned about the state of the country. Clearly, we survived all of that apocalyptic rhetoric, and fate has led us here to this conference, but we can now take the time to step back and look at just exactly what happened in 2016. At the time, I was 16 years old, attending a Catholic high school back home. I was not yet old enough to vote, but it was the first time I had actually been interested in the vote, and so to me, it was also the first time I realized that Catholics don't vote as a monolithic block, where divine truth has somehow told us which candidate to pick. Instead, we were faced with what many considered unchristian or not extremely devout options, where one candidate faced opposition from the Pope himself, and the other supported abortion legislation, which is often a Catholic no-go. Some called it one of the prime paradoxes of the 2016 election. In other words, how could a religious person support a candidate who flaunted adultery or praised Planned Parenthood or admitted to never asking for God's forgiveness? Many faith leaders eventually supported Trump, but they did not start out by doing so. For example, Ted Cruz appeared to be the original religious frontrunner on the right. Over the course of the election, however, religious and political leaders started to give in to the idea that Trump would become the nominee and ultimately represent the Republican Party. Some chose to endorse Trump outright, others chose to endorse Clinton, or instead remained silent for the entire election. That being said, the evolution of choice of candidate on religious grounds specifically begs the question of how religious leaders, or more importantly, religious individuals, made that key determination to support a candidate. So with my research at the Sanford School, what I really wanted to delve deeper is how religious groups and religious people made that decision. Specifically, I wanted to study how religious groups supported or opposed a particular candidate and what went into the calculation when finally in the ballot box. And because we live in what many of us call a tri-faith country, I ended up analyzing Protestants, Catholics, and Jews. Of course, there are always more faith communities, but these are the most widely studied and with the most data for this election. And as you can see, renowned academic Will Herberg set the stage for a study of religion in America at the national level by making sure that you have to look at these three faiths together. So I predicted before beginning that the religion is increasingly losing its foothold on the American decision maker and voter, and therefore religious groups and individuals would be way more willing to sacrifice their religious beliefs in order to promote their policy agenda. And I also thought that 2016 would be the best example of that yet. So to go about answering my central research question, I thought about it the way I imagined that most voters came to their decision. They plugged in their religious beliefs and their ideology. They compared the stakes involved, like what moral sacrifices they were making compared to the reward for a candidate, and they finally made the decision for which candidate they were going to support. For some people in 2016, this equation was quite easy, but for others, this process was grueling. But what this meant for my research was to look at the historical context of these groups first, then perform what's called stakeholder analysis, and finally analyze the election results. So these are the three traditions that spent the most money for political action committees, lobbying, and direct support for candidates. Demographically, Protestants make up 43% of America, Catholics at 20%, and Judaism at 2%. And Christianity as a whole still makes up roughly 65% of people in the United States as of 2019. These Abrahamic traditions share many political characteristics in common, but they also have many differences. In one, political positions in the 2016 election, two, abilities to affect the political process, and three, their final assessments of the 2016 election. Taking a look at these major differences, the paper I wrote aimed to analyze what the cost-benefit calculation went into political decision-making and what stakes were involved for each religious group. A stakeholder analysis involves defining the relevant actors, understanding the context they were operating under, and observing what risks and rewards would come from backing any particular candidate. In this case, the relevant actors are religious groups loosely defined under their umbrella terms of Protestant, Catholic, and Jew. Now, arguably the oldest influence on American politics is the Protestant tradition, made up of over 200 denominations in the United States and around 45,000 denominations worldwide. Protestantism traces its American roots back to the very foundation of the country, which is why I'm going to talk about it the most in this presentation. First of all, there's an important distinction between the different types of Protestants that I acknowledge, with evangelical Protestants generally more conservative and mainline Protestants generally more liberal. But religious scholar and the author of Religion and the Culture Wars, John Green, did an interview with PBS where he talks about evangelicals, specifically saying, one belief is that the Bible is inerrant. It was without error in all of its claims about the nature of the world and the nature of God. One would expect, therefore, that the political behavior of such an evangelical person would be to vote in line with the Bible, including the infallibility of things like the Golden Rule or the Beatitudes, or any other teachings from Jesus about behavior. Political candidates evangelicals vote for under this premise would have to be the most in line with a Christ-like figure, someone with Christian character, although they didn't necessarily have to be Christian themselves. A good example of that was Ronald Reagan, where Protestants came out in tremendous support for him, even though he had a shaky history with conservatism coming from his background as an actor in California. On the road to Donald Trump, religious historian and truly an expert on Protestantism in the US, John Fay wrote the book you can see here called Believe Me, talking about evangelicals across the country deciding that strongman politics was more worthwhile than the older Christian character model. Strongman politics means choosing a political strongman, or sometimes in Christian terminology, a political messiah, to get your agenda done. The main reason for this was the big shift that happened in the 20th century, where things like Roe versus Wade, the divorce revolution, the psychology revolution, removal of school prayer, etc., were all major challenges to the traditional way of life that evangelicals and Protestants alike knew and loved. Now, all of this made white Christian evangelicals and conservatives partake in what's known as white evangelical fear, which led to finding a political strongman as opposed to a Christ-like figure, and that strongman would get the job done no matter the cost. And so we get to Jerry Falwell. In the Believe Me book, John Fay talks about Jerry Falwell Sr. making a political playbook for the religious right, uniting them around issues like abortion and marriage, and putting religion and religious people on a crusade against all those that challenge them. Quoting from Fay here, in 1979, Falwell formed the Moral Majority, an organization designed to raise money for conservative politicians and to encourage people of faith to seize power in the federal government and to rid the country of pornography, abortion, and homosexuality. They fought against communism, socialism, and all forms of big government and sought to restore America to its Christian roots. And this playbook has been in play ever since. The religious right found a home in the Republican Party at this time and generally blended the separation between being conservative and being religious. Now, I can't emphasize enough the importance of Jerry Falwell, but don't just take my word for it. As recently as 2017, the Gospel Herald published an article called Why Jerry Falwell Sr. is Equally Important as Ronald Reagan to the Republican Party. Now, for the sake of time, I combined Catholicism and Judaism to have a much more checkered conversation in the United States. Neither religion has been in the majority in this country. There's always been waves of anti-Catholic, anti-Zionism, and anti-Semitism. And most Catholics and Jews in the country come from immigration waves way later in American history than Pilgrims and Puritans, immigration of which was heavily opposed. That said, both groups have often pulled above their weight politically. John F. Kennedy was the first Catholic president, and now Joe Biden is the second. While there have been no Jewish presidents, Chuck Schumer is currently the majority leader of the Senate. Catholics and Jewish businessmen also exert a great deal of power, with a late Jewish casino owner from Las Vegas, and actually my dad's old boss, Sheldon Adelson, donating millions and millions of dollars for his foreign policy agenda. And so going into the 2016 election, we had these key stances. Obviously, it's hard to pinpoint exactly what stances go on at an individual level, but this table reflects my research and academia's understanding of religious groups and leaders' position on key issues in 2016. This religious context went into each voter's decision-making process when at the ballot box, especially if they're Protestant, Catholic, or Jew themselves. So just to remind everyone in the audience, the 2016 election was truly a fascinating competition in politics. Here you can see the finalists, Senator Marco Rubio, Trump, and Senator Ted Cruz on the left, and Senator Bernie Sanders and Clinton on the right. Now, given one's vote as a function of their religious context and assessing the candidates, each voter had to think about how a candidate was going to benefit the country or their personal lives. They had to consider the moral, economic, political, and social risks involved in selecting their candidate as opposed to someone else who might do the job differently. So Protestants. Protestants were super important in the 2016 election, and they continued to be throughout the entire Trump presidency. John Fay's book from earlier will tell you just how much Trump rallies and Trump's targeting of the religious right really did work. Even Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio were constantly campaigning towards Protestants and evangelicals in order to gain their support. Many of these individuals were working class or lower middle class citizens who had gone through the 2008 financial crisis or the Obama administration and just didn't like what happened. And multiple sources, including Clinton's own team, will tell you that the Democrats made little to no effort to campaign directly towards evangelical voters. What happened in 2016, though, was the best evidence yet of the marriage between the religious conservatives and the Republican Party. It was never necessarily the case that being one meant the other. You could be an evangelical and not vote for the Republican Party, although statistically the numbers were already in that direction. But no other demographic voted for Trump the same way that evangelicals did in 2016, which has massive implications politically for the coming years about the importance of the religious right in the Republican Party. Now, for Catholics, the story wasn't as dramatic, but it was still important. We know the context of pro-life, but Catholics don't always vote that way, and they certainly didn't vote that way in 2016. I was actually surprised, though, to find out that the consensus candidate who received 50% or more of the Catholic vote was Donald Trump. On the surface, the Catholic Church, including the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, has some pretty conservative views, like being anti-gay marriage or anti-abortion. It seems, though, that they've been getting increasingly conservative in recent years, and one example is by writing a letter to Congress formally denouncing Senate Bill 788, the Equality Act, which granted some protections and rights to transgender people. That said, you can see the quote on the screen from Pope Francis, which many pundits thought that was calling Trump unsuitable to be president, and an indicator for how Catholic Americans should have voted in 2016. Now, with the Jewish community, you're wound up to paint a different picture depending on if you're talking about Orthodox, Conservative, or Reform Judaism in the United States. That said, some important events that define the Jewish vote in 2016 were this. Other than Sheldon Adelson and other right-wing Jewish leaders and businessmen, Trump had a very bumpy road with the Jewish community. At an event in December 2015, he made a comment about not wanting to take money from Jewish fundraisers there and questioned if anyone there didn't want to negotiate a deal. David Duke, the former KKK Grand Wizard, endorsed Trump, and Trump did not immediately disavow or condemn David Duke, which faced some Jewish backlash. He held back on condemning anti-Semitic comments against journalist Julia Yaffe, and lastly promoted the America First agenda, which many saw as American isolationism, which delayed our involvement in World War I and II in the 20th century. Now, shortly after the Yaffe incident, Sheldon Adelson endorsed Trump and began supporting the campaign effort financially, which in the end totaled $82 million in 2016 and $172 million in 2020, which was the record for any one individual. That being said, there are more anti-Semitic groups that gave their support for Trump than Clinton in 2016, and that context is also super important to understand. So now I want to show you a couple of graphics about the religious vote in 2016 in the context of the recent elections that we've had. This chart comes from the Pew Research Center, and I want you to pay special attention to the rightmost column, which represents change from 2012 to 2016. As you can see, Protestants, Catholics, other faiths, unaffiliated, and especially evangelicals all voted in higher proportions for the Republican candidate than the Democrat compared to 2012. Surprisingly enough, Mormons actually voted 4 points more for Democrats in 2016 than 2012. So in the end, we come back to the process of how a religious group, or more importantly, a religious individual, made that decision to support a particular candidate, weighing the context of their religion, the stakes involved, and the candidates they had to choose from, and finally selecting a candidate. Protestants predominantly supported Trump, Catholics as well, and Jews voted for Clinton. These groups also donated in numbers really never seen before, with some of the political actions committees you can see on the screen. They also argued for issues they care about, including some key issues that have been going on for decades we discussed earlier. But no single perfect formula can explain why a religious person voted the way they did. At the end of the day, it's a personal choice. That said, I want you to take the following major points from this research. Like I predicted, there is a major disconnect between voting by one's faith and voting by one's political agenda. To be clear, the old game is gone. The title of this panel sums that up perfectly. Spirituality in politics, in the traditional understanding, is decaying. For evangelicals, voting for Trump was placed above any problems they had with his character or background. For Clinton, the Catholics were faced between someone denounced by Pope Francis and someone who supported anti-Catholic policies like abortion. And for Jews, even with their most Zionistic or democratic positions on Israel, they were voting for Democrats who were not the most Zionistic political figures. Religion just doesn't have the grasp it did in recent decades. But looking towards the future, we are going to see a growing marriage between the Republican Party and evangelicalism. There wasn't enough time in the paper or in this presentation, but future research should look into other faiths, like the growing alliance between the Democratic Party and Islam. But even though religiosity in general is on the decline in the country, religion clearly continues to play a huge role in American politics. There's never been an atheist president in this country's history, and that trend will probably continue well into our lifetimes. Now, religion and politics are far more intermingled than the average political commentator will give credit. In many parts of this country, religion is the single factor in political behavior. But that said, religion is not everything everywhere. If the average citizen could only choose candidates who align perfectly with the Torah, the Bible, the Quran, they would not be able to vote. The big change, though, is for voting people who are very far away from your religious beliefs. This shift is a modern idea where candidates are not chosen by how closely they align with the moral figurehead of a religion, but rather how much they are the political figurehead of an ideology. It is important to see the humanity, though, in all those across the political spectrum, because every voter made value judgments about what matters to them the most, and many of these judgments transcended the strict rules and codes from their religion. I personally do not make any moral evaluations about the voting habits of any particular religious group. Rather, I hope you are as fascinated about me reconciling the religious vote with the non-religious candidate. That concludes my presentation. Once again, thank you so much for everyone at the Duke Sanford School of Public Policy for supporting my research, and for those at UWM's Religious Studies Student Organization, and for everyone else who made this conference possible. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you so much to all three of our presenters in this second panel. It was really a fascinating topics. All three of you appreciated Denise Isham, Sayama Katune, and Kyle Melatti's work on this, especially when we're doing going through the pandemic and just all the other things that are going on. I would like to open this up right now for discussion. We are going to take 5 extra minutes so we have a proper enough time to really reflect upon and discuss what we just heard. So we'll go to 11:45 and we'll have a little bit shorter lunch. I apologize for that. So let's break it off into questions. David Di Valerio, you had a question, please go.
Yeah, hi. So I'd like to engage with Denise for a little bit. So first I'd like to check that she is still here. Denise, are you still with us?
Yes, I'm still
Great.
here.
Hi. So I really appreciated your presentation, and I really like this focus on the question of seclusion, right, which is such an important part of many religious traditions. So I'm in the process of doing a big research project, which I'm writing a book about the history of these seclusion practices in Tibetan Buddhism, where men and women will go off to a cave and stay there for a year, 3 years, 10 years, or longer. So I'd like to sort of talk to you about this a little bit. So I have 2 questions. The first question is, for my research project, I'm doing this study by looking at manuals that talk about how to do these kind of seclusion practices, where to go, how to get food while you're isolated like this, how you should not interact with other people. So my question is, for Islam, is there a tradition, or in Islam, is there a tradition of writing about how to do these kinds of seclusion practices, or is it mainly looking at the examples from the lives of saintly figures or the prophet himself saying, we should be like him? Is there a sort of tradition of laying out explicitly, this is how you do the practice?
First of all, thank you so much for your question. I'm really happy that I have the opportunity to explain it a little bit more in detail. In Islamic understanding, there are different types of seclusion too. And regular Muslims, not just Sufis, also go into seclusions, and it is called itikaf, especially during Ramadan. You stay in seclusion for 30 days in a mosque or masjid, and there are strict rules of it written in classical works. So some different types of seclusion has manuals and rules, and what you do and what you are not allowed to do are written strictly. However, there are another approaches to seclusion too, which you are a bit more flexible. You can choose your own way of doing. And the classical works of Islamic mysticism written by Sufi forebears explain the traditional seclusion crudely without going too much into detail. So my answer to your question is that it depends on the type of seclusion. Some are really flexible, some are really strict. And you can learn more about the seclusion rules and how you go into seclusion through the classical works of Islamic mysticists. If you can contact me, I can send you the names of the books, if available, the books itself. Also, the essence of seclusion stays the same. Fasting, worshiping, reading holy texts, being on your own, speaking less, eating less, and sleeping less. These practices, these principles stay the same, and other factors and applications differ. And some seclusions also include a leader, a spiritual leader. You are staying in the seclusion with your spiritual leader, your murid, and he helps you with your journey of seclusion. So it's a bit more multidimensional issue.
Great. Okay, that's very interesting. So yeah, it sounds like there's a parallel tradition to the one I'm looking at, where it's people have been having, you know, conversations about how to do this, maybe even debates about how to do this, you know, for a long period of time, and you can kind of trace the history of the practice perhaps through that literature. That's excellent. The second thing I'd like to ask you about is, have you sort of looked at other religious traditions and their forms of seclusion and made any kind of comparison? Have you learned anything from thinking about it in that way? So I'm just curious what you have to say about that, and I thank you for allowing me to talk to you today.
Well, to be honest, I was just focused on, my emphasis was placed on the Islamic mysticist approach to seclusion, and I've not conducted a research on other religions' approach to seclusion.
Great, thank you.
Thank you
so
too.
much for the thank you for the question, Dr. Di Valerio, and Denise as well. We were wondering if you could share with us your slides. If you could just send that file to us, we can, just so we can have access to that. We weren't able to quite see them during the presentation because it looked like they're really good. Really, I'm sorry we weren't able to see them all. I did have a question in the chat for Saima. How does the practice of Sufi religious ecstasy become seclusive and or inclusive spiritually? I don't know if I butchered that question or not. Oh, yes, please do answer.
Thank you for the question, Marva, Brooke. Regarding religious ecstasy experienced in the Sufi community, it is different than seclusion, as I have studied the three genre of musical performances. I mentioned as zikr, sama, and qawwali, that those performances are not take place in seclusion. Rather, it is a collective performance, and through the performative ritual, the Sufi try to lift themselves into a higher consciousness. So that is different from inclusion, as Em just mentioned, that Sufi also practice inclusion, seclusion for their different rituals. But I have studied the performances that actually take place in a collective form, and that took them to ecstatic state. Ecstatic states also can be experienced in solitude, but my focus was only in those that took place in the collective performances. So that is also that we can also explore that that ecstasy that can be experienced in seclusion. But mine is a musical performance, and so that is other part of us, the other side of seclusion. Thank you so much, Marva.
Marva, did that answer your question? Oh, good. I see a thank you right there. I think that's the affirmative.
Yeah, it is. Thank you.
I have another question in the chat as well, and this is for Mr. Melatti. This is a couple different questions. They're pretty related, though. The first one is, which religious group do you think is most prone to switching between partisan groups? And related, in terms of switching, do you think the shifts, so switching from Trump to Biden in the 2020 election reveal, one, a shifting allegiance between evangelicals and the Republican Party, two, the shifting demographics in American voters, for example, a recent Gallup poll that less than 50% of Americans belong to a church, synagogue, or mosque, which is the first time that dipped below 50% since that research poll has been asking that question. Or three, a matter of voter turnout, like are mainline Christians or evangelicals more likely to vote, or maybe four, some other explanation. So really, what's the shift in voting from the 2016 to the 2020 election? And then also related, which religious groups do you think are more prone to switching between partisan groups?
Yeah, so both of these are really, really fascinating questions. To answer the first one, I can't really pinpoint a particular religious group, although I will say that, especially evangelicalism has seen a tremendous rise with its relationship to the Republican Party. So I would say that if you were to, for example, not have had Trump in 2016, I don't think we would have seen the voter turnout for the Republican Party in the same numbers, in the same way. I think that there was a huge shift as far as voter turnout went. And important to note is that that poll, or sorry, the numbers I showed you represented percentage change. They didn't represent number change. A lot more people voted in 2016 than they did in 2012. And so actually the vote itself was diluted quite a bit because there was just so many more evangelicals voting for Trump in 2016 than they did for Romney in 2012. And we saw something similar in the 2020 election with record vote out numbers and record turnout. But I will say for 2020 specifically, I would say that COVID was the single driving factor for the shift from Trump to Biden. I actually wouldn't put the shift on religion itself. I think that might be one of the things, it might be one of the confounding factors, but the single driving factor in just my personal research and my understanding of academia's content for the 2020 election was basically saying that it was the COVID election. And if COVID had not happened, Trump very likely would have had evangelical support once again. That said, there are trends and changes that are happening in the country, and we're seeing pushback for that right now, just as recently as the voter restriction laws that are getting passed in the South. And there is pushback from what I call white evangelical communities for doing that, and we're probably going to see that continue for the next year or two, leading to the midterms.